Welcome to the podcast today. Reuben Steff is a geopolitical analyst and academic whose work focuses on the great power rivalry, security strategy, and the position of smaller states like New Zealand within a transforming global world order. We're going to be reflecting a little bit on 2025 and speculating on what 2026 will bring in three main areas: Venezuela, Russia, Ukraine, and China. It's not enough to scrape a portion of our income away to plan for a better life tomorrow if we don't scrape a bit of our headspace away and think about what that better world tomorrow is actually going to look like. Now, please give us a like and a subscribe on the way through. If you've been listening in and a new subscriber in 2025, thank you very much for your support. Really looking forward to sharing some more stuff in 2026 with you. Let's get started. All right, Reuben Steff, thank you for joining me on the latest episode of the Everyday Investor Podcast. How are you?
Great, Darcy. Thanks for having me again.
It's been a while since we've caught up, but I want to take the pulse of 2025 and also cast our eyes onto 2026. What are we heading into? So we have the United States redrawing red lines in the Americas. We have Russia not budging in Ukraine, China pushing the limits in the South Pacific. And when you look at all these arenas all together, is 2026 going to be the year of staying out of my backyard? And is this the end of strategic ambiguity?
Clearly, in the Western Hemisphere, the Americans are looking to completely lock down that area. Venezuela, clearly right now, is kind of the case study we're all fixated on. And this also aligns with the recent and newly released 2025 US National Security Strategy, which everyone should go have a look at because it is something. It really seems to be kicking off any notion that the Americans are going to continue to disproportionately pay to uphold and defend this kind of liberal rules-based order. And there's a whole bunch of different aspects to that, but for the sake of our current conversation, it's that they've announced what they call the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine under the US president that the European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere. So we're going back, almost a couple hundred years ago now. That was then updated by a Roosevelt corollary to that doctrine in 1904 that said the US would sometimes intervene or use police power in the Western Hemisphere to restore order, basically to undermine or remove regimes that were at odds with America's interests. In this new NSS, National Security Strategy, it announced a Trump corollary to all of that updates that for the new age. Basically, America will go after drug runners, people that export fentanyl, cocaine, will target migration or try to reduce migration from the Western or Latin America to the United States, and that it will basically try to remove, reduce, counter foreign influence. So you're talking really about Russia, China, and to a lesser degree, Iran in Latin America. Now, they picked Venezuela. Venezuela is a country that is friendly with all those other regimes I just mentioned, but so is Cuba, by the way. So by threatening and sanctioning and starting to really now contain the export of gas and oil from Venezuela, Trump is sending a signal to the entire Western Hemisphere and saying, hey, you've got to be careful here. Like, yes, Venezuela is kind of the weak duckling here we can pick on, but Colombia, Brazil, Cuba, you could be next unless you get into line. So that's what that really seems to be about. And some are saying this is a new spheres of influence strategy the Americans are enacting, where they're saying, hey, look, Europe, the Middle East, other parts of the world, yes, are significant to our interests, but they are now a lower priority. Our first order priority is locking down the Western Hemisphere. And then if we move, say, to Europe, hey, Europeans, you guys got to get off your asses and you got to start containing Russia because we need to draw down resources from there. And what's behind all of this really is the China challenge. The Americans, through this new document, although they don't identify China as an ideological threat, because that's what a liberal would probably do, would say, hey, it's dictatorship, it's Xi Jinping, he's the problem. If you're stripping out the liberal ideology from American foreign policy, Trump is saying, well, no, China is our major kind of competitor. It's kind of we are near equals now. There might be times when we have to do deals with one another, even work with one another's, but nonetheless, in the military and strategic sphere, we identify China as our core competitor. So this kind of rearrangement of the American priority set, if you will, away from Europe, to some degree degree away from the from Middle East, is to elevate both the Western Hemisphere and China as the kind of primary considerations in America's grand strategy.
Wow. Okay. So at a real high level, you frame that perfectly well. Let's now maybe break it up into two or three sort of sub areas, I think. Like, so let's talk about Venezuela first, and then maybe Ukraine, and then we'll bring it back to China and New Zealand. So with Venezuela, in the U.S. right now, we're seeing one of the biggest military buildups in the Caribbean that we've seen for ages. Carrier groups, Aegis destroyers, thousands of troops sitting off the coast of Venezuela. And in my best Canadian accent, what is this all about? Is it about drugs? Is it about oil, deep state, World War III, or all of the above?
To some degree, all the above. And I think it also reflects the different factions within the Trump administration that, as it pertains to Venezuela, are concerned, have their own concerns, if you will. For example, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State right now, who clearly is a very prominent figure in the administration, has Trump's trust, and is constantly giving kind of talks and speeches where he outlines America's view of the world right now. He is from Florida. His family come from Cuba, and that expat group now kind of, I don't know if you'd call them Latin Americans in Florida. They're a strong power base within the Trump administration, within the Republican Party. And for a long time, they've been strongly opposed to the Cuban regime, to the Venezuelan regime. So I think it partly reflects his kind of personal, maybe ideological opposition to the Venezuelan government. They are opposed to Latin American sort of autocracy, if you will. Their people had to flee these regimes to go to the United States. When it comes to Trump himself, the reporting suggests that, he's very concerned about drugs, fentanyl, cocaine flooding into America. And apparently he's a long-time teetotaler. He doesn't do drugs. His younger brother older brother committed suicide, became a drug addict, an alcoholic, and so on. So he maybe has his own personal emotional concerns, if you will, about drug imports into the United States. To the extent Trump has any deep sort of sentimentality, drugs and drug imports seem to be something he is concerned about. And yeah, then you also have, hey, this can be a geostrategic maneuver. So realists is a school of thought in international relations that basically says you should prioritize your material national interests, not ideology, not liberalism. You should prioritize your immediate region, right? Because if your immediate region is penetrated, then you can be directly threatened. Once you have secured that region, then like concentric circles, you can expand your influence outwards and outwards and outwards. So some realists might say, well, look, having this threat here just off our coast in Cuba and Venezuela, that is a potential entry point to threaten us. And you want to nip it in the bud while you can. And if you go back to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, that's when the Russians emplaced short-range nuclear missiles in Cuba that kicked off a major crisis with the United States. Who's to say Venezuela could not become a point for something like that in the future? That China, Russia, or other malign actors wouldn't use Venezuela as a direct and very proximate target point for the American mainland. So to some degree, I think there's kind of a realist geostrategic argument for going after Venezuela as well. So there's all these different factions inside the United States. And one final thing, you might say, well, how does this relate to China? If China is the priority threat or is kind of equal with Western Hemisphere, well, again, you want to lock down your hemisphere so you don't have to worry about China pushing in through their drugs, fentanyl, trying to do security relationships, finding military bases and ports that could threaten you in the future. And if you can do that at a relatively low cost now before the threat truly manifests into something significant, you can then redirect those resources to the Pacific and to China.
And I think to a certain extent, we kind of would have this view. I don't know about if this is the correct view, but this is definitely one of my views that I've had, but I'm kind of changing it more recently, that you have this US-China power conflict that's at play, but you seldom kind of connect it to the drug story. And in the US, where they're having almost 200 fentanyl deaths a day at the moment, and they blame it on a drug corridor that basically runs through the country. And I know it might sound like they're two separate things, China and a drug problem in the States, but clearly they view it as one of the same, which kind of indicates that maybe the Chinese Communist Party is using that as a way to destabilize the United States. Is there truth to that, or is that maybe a little bit too off the beaten track to suggest that?
It's not off the beaten track. It does get discussed. I think the problem is we simply don't know if China is actually doing that. Do they turn a blind eye to factories in China producing fentanyl that then find a way to get it into Latin America, into the United States, because they know this is an easy way to undermine America's, well, communities? As you said, if 200 people dying a day, that's a lot of people dying. That's like a low-level civil war. So it's plausible to me. Whether it's happening or not, factually, I don't think we know. And Trump does seem to have, he is seeming to want to find ways to do deals with China. I mean, we had the whole, obviously Liberation Day, the tariffs placed on China, and now some of those are kind of been unwound. Trump and Xi have talked a couple times. It does seem like economically they've tried to stabilize the economic relationship. Is part of that. In fact, I'm pretty sure in the press statements, you see part of that is that China has pledged to do more on fentanyl. So again, that could be something going on in the background. Just before we move on, I would say that while Trump has said, Venezuela is exporting a large amount of fentanyl into the United States, apparently there's not much evidence of that. A lot of the drugs come through Mexico and Colombia rather than through Venezuela. Now, are there some connections there? Is there some network that assists some of that? Potentially. But that's why some people find the whole drugs argument to be a bit potentially disingenuous. But I mean, what is Trump, if not quite often disingenuous, throwing multiple things at the wall to see what sticks to make his argument?
Sure. And so if we kind of think about this, like potential hotspot that's flaring up in this area, what is the likelihood, though, that this actually spills over into kinetic warfare of some sort? Like, we've got a huge military buildup in the Caribbean, and there's rumors that the deep state, the CIA, might be involved here a little bit as well, and that's definitely off the beaten track. These ships being confiscated potentially, oil tankers now being escorted by Venezuela military. So I just want to know, like, what would it take? Would it be just like a simple spark that could actually trigger kinetic warfare? Is that maybe part of the intention, going back to like Vietnam? Will there be a false flag type event on purpose, or what do you think could actually happen in 2026 there?
I mean, something like that could occur. There's some accident at sea, some American ship or jet is targeted or shot down or what have you, and then the Americans either exploit that to go after Venezuela on land, like kinetically, rather than just at sea, as they've been doing so far. At the same time, Trump is, if there's one thing about Trump, it's that actually he is very careful about the use of military power. And he said that from the very, very beginning when he was running in 2015, 2016. Even earlier this year, when he assisted Israel in bombing the Iranian nuclear sites, that seemed to come after it became clear that the Israelis were having a lot of success. And then Trump was like, okay, let's come in too and finish the deal, finish the job, right? By trying to take out some of the most significant Iranian nuclear sites. So he's always very careful about the use of force. So I think he does not want to get stuck in a kind of Vietnam or Iraq scenario, a very long-term, unending conflict with no end in sight. Now, there's some reason to believe that probably wouldn't happen in Venezuela anyway, just given the nature of the Venezuelan opposition being quite unified. This is a nation that once upon a time was quite economically prosperous and so on. And that we could imagine, given how poorly the Venezuelan regime have run their affairs in recent decades, that a good chunk of the country actually may be willing to see these guys gone. In the last election, apparently 70% voted for the opposition, and then Maduro just, rigged it right at the end, or whatever, ignored the outcome. Yeah. But setting that aside, I think Trump wants to reduce any chance that this could end up in a prolonged conflict, because part of his appeal, I think, to Americans is that they've come out of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that basically failed, and they don't want to get into another one anytime soon, especially in a country, Venezuela, where some people might not quite see the rationale for whatever reason, even though earlier we were going through what the rationale could be. Yeah. I think also it looks to me like a pressure campaign. It's this very gradual escalatory pressure campaign on Maduro himself, maybe his family and regime, to say, hey, if you guys get out of here, fly to Moscow, maybe we'll give you safe haven, even in the United States, whatever. Hand over the oil, hand over the institutions, do everything we say, and there's a way for you out of this. But
Mm.
Maduro, as you can imagine, he is sitting there going, well, can I trust the Americans? I mean, the Libyans kind of did what the Americans wanted, and then they got bombed in 2011. Iraq, Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, it turned out, although he was bluffing and claimed he did, so it's a bit more complex there. So the Maduro regime are probably just wondering, well, can we actually believe them? But it looks to me like they want to get rid of them without actually having to use military force on land in Venezuela. That's my best guess.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I guess what happens afterwards will be really interesting as well, because as Trump claims, they stole our oil. And I think at a surface level, it sounds like a nonsensical thing to say that, but you realize that Chevron and I can't remember the other company had massive operations in Venezuela when it was more of a free market. And then when communism kind of creeped in, they did effectively steal those operations or those licenses that were given to exploit the oil. So yeah, I guess what happens in 2026 will be pretty clear. It's kind of hard to move all of those assets into a region, I would imagine, and then withdraw them like discreetly without having some sort of event, though, right?
Yep, that's the danger, that Trump may have got himself into a situation that he can't easily extract himself from without some win, right? Because Trump is all about strength. He's all about symbolism and showing off his power and getting others to kind of bend the knee or give him gifts or give him something. So I agree. I think he needs something here from the Maduro regime, and whether he can get that without Maduro himself stepping down, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's definitely one of the hot spots to watch in 2026. And another one would be Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I think from a New Zealand perspective, we live in a very interesting bubble in a way, in that we don't generally look at these global events as significant enough to alter our holiday plans this summer, right? Like these things are out there. They're not really internal into our world. We don't really have to factor them into how we invest or how we plan our life or what we encourage our kids to do when they get older. But I think coming from a European perspective, it might look a little bit different looking at Russia and Ukraine. And from your perspective, I know you have some connections over there in Europe. So do you feel like in Europe they are well and truly, just from a societal perspective, are they really on a war footing? Like, do they believe that conflict with Russia is inevitable?
I don't think their societies are, right? At a kind of mass level. The elites, however, they are, the rhetoric these days is sometimes quite scary. I mean, you'll have former MI5 people, or even just actually standing MI5 people in the UK, or intelligence people in Germany and France, now overtly coming out and saying, hey, we believe war with Russia is distinctly possible in the next few years. Some are even throwing out years. I don't know if they're just throwing that out to try and galvanize action and scare people, but they'll say in 2028, we think there's a decent probability or possibility of conflict. You see on a regular basis now that, Germany, the Brits, France, Poland, and the Baltic states, Finland, all of whom are massively increasing their military spending. The factories apparently are trying to ramp up drone production and production of all different forms of military platforms and so on, and artillery and what have you. So it looks like it's all go, but how quickly that translates into actual actionable military capability, I'm not sure. And I think that's probably what they're afraid of, that yes, by 2030, the European armies may be all mobilized and tooled up for a battle with Russia, but it's the gap from here to there, especially in a world where Russia is already mobilized, despite having quite significant problems in Ukraine, but already mobilized. It's on a kind of economic war footing. Its factories are going 24 hours a day. It's getting a lot of assistance from China, Russia, Iran, and that assistance has deepened and expanded over time. Apparently, Russia currently has 250,000 troops in Belarus right now who are there for training, probably R&R, but they are directly proximate to the Baltic states, to Poland and other key areas of Europe. So society writ large, no. I think if we walk around the average street of a European, Central or Western European city, and we talk to the average person do you think war with Russia is going to occur tomorrow? Are you yourself taking measures to, protect yourself? Do you have a kit at home, a resiliency kit for when war comes? I think a lot of them are like, well, no, not really. I'm doing my job with my family. I'm going to the pub. I don't think the average European, even though they're probably worried about war in the future. I don't think right now, on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, they're that worried about it, is my suspicion. But the elite are, the discourse is shifting. It has been shifting for over a year now. And I think that's what, in New Zealand, you might see the odd headline where, oh, the German, president said this or that. But I think we are not quite truly feeling what the elite over there are feeling and how the urgency they feel around it.
Yeah, I guess the more you have to lose, the more you're sensitive you're going to be with these things, right? So, yeah, if you don't have assets, and if you don't have assets in that region, then of course, well, who cares, right? We can just move to another country if things go down. Maybe there's a certain sort of chilled out attitude that they have. I don't know, but like if you just think about that, going back to Russia and Ukraine right now, if you think about that conflict, who's actually winning right now? Like, is Russia winning? Is Ukraine winning? Is it just like one of those long, protracted things that we talked about that Trump doesn't want to get involved in with Venezuela? Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, this is to me where there's a lot of hyperbole, and it looks to me like Russian disinformation and misinformation has actually made pretty good inroads into Western media, both European and also Anglosphere media. And that, you'll sometimes just hear a podcaster or some commentator saying, oh, well, Ukraine's clearly lost. And then you look at the battlefield and you look at how slowly the front lines are actually shifting. And yes, they've incrementally been shifting in Russia's favor over the last year or two, but it is incremental. It is tiny. I mean, the Russians, I think, took an additional 1% of Ukrainian territory in the eastern part of Ukraine over the last year and would have experienced deaths of tens of thousands of young Russian men and material and resources. So to me, it doesn't look like there's any decisive swing imminent. Now, things can happen because war, sometimes contingencies occurs. There can be breakdowns. A front line could collapse, or the Russians have some backup shock troops that have been training for years that are about to smash through the front lines, or there's some new technological development on the horizon. I mean, we've been seeing this constant iteration of drone technology throughout this conflict in ways we did not anticipate at the beginning. So maybe something could suddenly shift in Russia's favor. But to me, just going on current trends, it's almost a stalemate. It's a stalemate with a slight lean in Russia's direction because of Russia's manpower, Russia's material, Russia's propaganda system, right? In Russia itself. Russia's support from China, which has been a critical enabler of Russia throughout this. If Russia did not have China basically buying up its oil, helping it bust sanctions, providing dual-use goods, which are basically military goods, that Russia can then plug into its military-industrial complex, Russia would have had it. I don't know if Russia would have been able to sustain this war after a single year. So that's all pretty significant and decisive too. But to me, it's basically a stalemate with a slight lean towards Russia at this point. So I'd say just show a lot of caution when you hear talking heads saying, oh, Ukraine's lost, the West needs to completely reduce its support and so on. To me, that looks like a gross exaggeration and someone who has sort of been pulled into some ideological echo chamber.
Interesting. Okay. And that's good just to always be aware of the influence from these foreign states in the media and in our own country's media, and even just inadvertently, right? Like if I hear something on a podcast, I'll repeat it and makes sense to me, so I just kind of assume it's true, right? But it might not be true, and I guess that's how easy it is for these messages to spread, right? Especially when it's deep into some sort of ideological rabbit holes, which increasingly seem to be very common no matter where you go. Just on the technology level, I was curious about this because what you were saying there before with how China effectively is funneling support in through Russia to fight this war in Ukraine, which effectively is, let's just say it's against NATO, and then who's supporting NATO? Well, Europe, the US. So it's kind of like almost a US China proxy war in a weird way with intermediaries in between, right? But I guess what I'm interested in here is that during times of military conflict in the past, we've seen some of the biggest technological breakthroughs that have benefited society. And when I think about this as an investor, especially investing in some areas of technology, I just wonder how much new types of technology, like maybe even the combination of AI and robotics, that's an easy one. But are you seeing evidence of new types of technology that is slowly seeping through this military industrial complex?
Well, there's probably two, and they're kind of entangled. The first is the now omnipresence of drones, apparently, on the front lines of Ukraine, where There'll be drones for surveillance, but there'll be first-person vision suicide drones coming down on people. There'll be drones far up in the air. There's these different levels of drones. Apparently, again, every 6 to 8 weeks, there are kind of updates to the drone software and the drones themselves. So both sides are rapidly iterating and deploying new drones and new tactics as they go. And I've read that 80% of the deaths on the front lines now are from drones. So not artillery. Wow. Yeah, not artillery, not face-to-face combat. It is essentially drones killing people. So again, that was not expected at the beginning of the war. And Russia is churning out millions of drones a year. The Iranians helped them set up a factory because the Iranians apparently had made some kind of advances in drones in recent years. China is feeding inputs as well into all that drone technology, the drone factories and so on. And Ukraine is doing it too. And apparently, some of these are so cheap to put together, and some of them are quite simple, right? There's different levels of sophistication. But there are people in their garages across Ukraine putting together drones and then shipping them to the front lines for the troops to use and so on. So it's both coming from the deepest parts of the military-industrial complex, but even just people like me and you, Darcy, apparently could go chuck a drone together pretty cheaply, and then we can ship it off to help the front lines if we wanted to. The second is artificial intelligence. And this is where I think a lot of what is occurring, I don't know to what degree it's really coming out in public yet, but they can be used to aggregate data about what's happening on the battlefield, surveillance, from the drones themselves, from satellites, from on the ground, to create pictures, ever greater, almost real-time pictures of what's happening on the battlefield. And this is all partly why it's so hard for there to be big shifts in the front lines right now. Because as soon as one side makes a move, assault group goes forward, or there's a mechanized infantry, they're immediately identified through surveillance, through artificial intelligence, and then drone swarms can come down and kill the troops coming forward. But we also saw, you might recall a few months ago, there was a daring and quite incredible attack that the Ukrainians managed to launch against Russian strategic bombers at multiple points across the Russian Federation, like as far north Siberia, far eastern Russia. You're talking about thousands of kilometers between these points of attack, where somehow the Ukrainians managed to smuggle in through containers or on trucks or what have you, into the deepest parts of Russia, where they had suicide drones in place that, once they were activated, used artificial intelligence to surveil the situation in front of them, to identify strategic bombers and to destroy them. And these strategic bombers are worth, billions of dollars. So that's where you see these new technological developments suddenly start to change the cost ratio, if you will. You could have a strategic bomber worth billions of dollars, but then a little drone that's worth a couple $100,000 destroy them. And we've also seen that in the Red Sea between the Americans and the Houthis, which is a kind of a side piece, right? But you're starting to see the kind of offense-defense cost ratio between different sides change as technological developments change. And it's very hard to know where this is going, right? And militaries themselves are now having big debates about what to do. The Americans, the Silicon Valley people that have now come in and are really trying to support the American military-industrial complex in recent sort of years, which is a cultural shift in Silicon Valley. They are saying, hey, look, we have these exquisite F-35s, these aircraft carriers that are worth billions and are incredible pieces of machinery. But what if an adversary can just deploy some drones or some relatively cheap ballistic missiles and take them all out? And we now to shift away from kind of exquisite and few in number technological military platforms increasingly to really cheap, millions and millions of low-cost drone swarms. But no one entirely knows what the future battlefield will look like and who will have the advantage. And of course, the Americans might have an aircraft carrier that in theory could be destroyed by some cheap drones, but then the Americans actually have some quite incredible anti-drone systems on those aircrafts. And in fact, I saw some tested the other day on YouTube where they're creating anti-drone platforms to destroy the drone swarms that are going to come at those aircraft carriers. So what happens on the battlefield? This is where the uncertainty really lies right now, and everyone's trying to figure out where to place their bets.
Yeah. It's crazy, isn't it? And I was quite interested just to see in the Middle East how Israel is starting to deploy. I can't remember what they called it, but they're lasers basically to shoot down incoming missiles. Have you looked into that much? And do you kind of see that will be the next iteration of advancement where lasers will be used to take down these drones?
Yes, I mean, I've seen some of the prototypes and so on, and from what we're hearing, they are effective, at least trials. But we'll have to wait and see until they're actually deployed. I haven't caught up lately if they have been deployed, but again, that's one thing where you just have a kind of counter technological development emerge that suddenly firing one of these lasers costs 10 cents or something. Just destroy a drone that, yeah, maybe that drone costs $10,000, but nonetheless, 10 cents is
Yeah.
a lot cheaper than $10,000.
Now, so turning our attention to China, closer to our neck of the woods here in New Zealand and the Pacific, of course, Beijing is pushing harder, it seems, in the South China Seas, and it's deepening its footprint across the South Pacific. So, do you think that China really has ambitions of global dominance, or is it more just about reacting or matching the power moves of the US?
Some would say, the appetite grows with the eating when it comes to great powers. So while China, at least sort of geostrategically, in terms of their military projection thus far, have really been focusing on their own region, South China Sea, having some influence over Southeast Asia, and now building out this big naval fleet. But that naval fleet, for the most part, still does seem to be about their kind of South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on. That as it expands its power, so too do your interests expand, so too do your ambitions expand. And we've seen this constantly throughout history, right? I mean, think of Rome. Rome, once upon a time, was a little village. As Rome grew, as the frontiers expanded, so too did its resources, so too did its interests to what it needed to defend, so too did its interactions with tribes and eventually kingdoms all around it. So it just kept expanding, right? And this is kind of what great powers do and what superpowers do. So while you look at Chinese rhetoric right now, and it does look like, hey, their core geostrategic interests are creating a sphere of influence immediately around them while creating global economic influence, which they now have, that they may just keep kind of going. At the same time, you're going to see there's some limits to that, perhaps relative to, say, the United States. Not many countries speak Chinese, right? Whereas English is a global language now, so to speak. Some would say the Chinese ideology is not that appealing. I would say, though, the Chinese governance model is increasingly appealing to countries because success partly breeds attraction, right? And more countries clearly are kind of looking at the liberal democratic project and going, well, look at you guys. You're not doing very well these days. You've got these internal culture wars. You've got incredible inequalities. Your social cohesion is collapsing. Your institutions are coming into question. And perhaps we can talk about this a bit later in a kind of bit more of a meta analysis. Whereas China, from the outside, looks pretty stable. High level of social cohesion. It has a deep 1,000-year-long, 3,000-year-long proud culture. Economically, it's getting wealthier and wealthier. It's moving up the value chain into advanced technologies, and so that means its global. It's the appeal of its model, its soft power, may grow in time too, which will ease the way for its influence to expand. Because countries that once upon a time might have been skeptical or even hostile to Chinese influence might start to say, well, actually, maybe we should change our tune and start to welcome in more Chinese influence. Oh, China, you now want a military base. Oh, we'll give it to you. Like it used to be, the Americans used to have a military base, but hey, they're old news. Let's bring in the Chinese to protect us, or however you want to view that. So I think if you look also at statements, they say by 2049, if you look at kind of their military intentions, they want to be a first-class military power, which means they want to be equal to the US military by 2049. And clearly, they'd probably like to do it sooner if they can. And then you start to say, well, what do you do when you have a giant military? Well, superpowers, great powers, they start to use it. You can get what you want without using it by building up forces on the border of a country or just sort of subtly threatening that you might use them. And that can lead to diplomatic breakthroughs, economic breakthroughs, and what have you, political breakthroughs. But of course, there might be times when you use it. You got a big hammer, you got a problem, boom. Hey, Malaysia, hey, I don't know, Mongolia, I'm just throwing out names here. We want you to give in on this economic issue, and the leaders of this or that country say no, and China says, bang, Now, the Chinese will say, well, we have a long history of non-interference and so on, but Many of the countries around them say, well, no, that's not true at all. We've had conflicts, we've had tensions with China throughout history. So they have this kind of self-mythology of themselves, but that's not how we feel. I mean, look at Vietnam, for example, which has had really tense and sometimes hostile relations with China throughout history. But there's many other countries around them too. They fought border wars with Russia as well. So I don't know if they have intentional global kind of military ambitions now, but could they in the future? Potentially. And that just may be a natural evolutionary product of the expansion of their wealth and influence and military power over time, rather than some nefarious grand strategic plan they have right now.
So it's just a function of who they are at this age and stage. And I guess that kind of speaks to their purpose or their values or their broader objectives. But when you think about their strategy and their tactics, another conversation I had recently was around the connection between things like live animal smuggling, drugs, illegal immigration, and money laundering within a bank in Oklahoma. And it was a bizarre story that I learned about. And it kind of just made me think, well, how often is China actually working perhaps through local organized crime networks to distribute either drugs or other types of activities? And are they instrumental in a lot of the destabilizing sort of activities that are occurring, either these imported culture wars that increasingly divide populations and these addictions and exploitations of peoples and rules and all that sort of stuff? That's the thing that they would then look to and say, criticize that, right? But they themselves may have a hand in actually engineering it. I know this is a bit of a leap, but here in the South Pacific, in New Zealand in particular, do you think that there are efforts like that happening within either Australia or New Zealand, where they're actually actively involved in our institutions, trying to destabilize our society on purpose?
It's hard to know, isn't it? To what degree this is like a directional, clear strategy that they are employing versus, transnational organized groups just doing what they do. Yeah. Is that kind of thing connected, say, to the Chinese Communist Party? Very hard to know. What I would say is pretty clear, and there's growing evidence around this, is the work that people like Anne Applebaum have done. So, which shows that Russia and China basically are using like misinformation. They're using the social media system, pushing thousands, if not millions, of bots out there to influence our discussions around culture and how society should be run, to plant false information and just try and push it out amongst Western populations, because, we don't have a great firewall. The Western world, we allow anything to come in, right? Any country just about anyone from any country or organization can jump on Twitter, sign up, and then just start spouting whatever crap they want. And if you go on Twitter these days, and like you should, like there's incredible information on Twitter, you can learn a lot about what's happening in the world, but there are just so many anonymous accounts constantly arguing, pushing ideas into the Western media ecosystem. And I have no doubt some of those are Iranian, Chinese, or Russian. And that's what some of the research tends to back up. As in, when it comes to, say, infiltrating our institutions, I mean, we have a Chinese diaspora here. We have Chinese business people. We have other groups, apparently some which are formally affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, that have kind of a soft power agenda, that are pushing ideas and so on. Yes, that is occurring in New Zealand. That's occurring in Australia. Some would say, well, other countries do that too. I mean, the Brits, they're diplomats from Britain. They're groups affiliated with America that are also here trying to promote America's interests and so on. So China's just doing the same thing. Maybe. I guess the question is what the intentions are and what the results of those policies are as it pertains to New Zealand's institutions and society, right? Do we judge some efforts by some countries to actually be broadly positive and it's in line with our values and it's not targeting our democratic governance system, but then maybe what China or other actors are doing does seem to be trying to undermine those democratic norms and so on? Maybe. This is an area that I think is quite understudied in New Zealand. I mean, Anne-Marie Brady of Canterbury University, she has been someone in recent years who's really been trying to speak out about this stuff, saying, hey, she believes there's kind of an infiltration subversion campaign underway in New Zealand. You can look at Helen Clark and John Key and Helen Clark, who both went to this meeting of the dictators, if you will, in Beijing recently, where there's an incredible propaganda event where China summoned for its big military parade leaders from around the world, but mostly from, Central Asia, Asia, some from Latin America and Africa and so on, but many dictatorial heads of government. But Helen Clark went along, John Key went along, and you're kind of like, what's going on here? You're not seeing many former presidents or prime ministers from the US or Europe or what have you there, but there's a couple notable former New Zealand prime ministers there. Some would say, well, John Key has business interests with China. Yep, I believe that's true. I think that's in public too. Helen Clark, she's a true believer in this notion of, hey, like we need to move beyond the antagonisms of whatever, the Anglosphere in China, and she's there as kind of a true moral representative, someone trying to build bridges. But I know some people say, well, no, maybe she's also compromised. Look, we can't prove it. I don't know if it's even worth saying, but there are suspicions about, hey, why these people go along to these things, and do they have some personal incentive or what have you. There was also the occasion a few years ago where there was a high-level national MP from China who apparently lied on his application, his citizenship application. He had former ties with maybe Chinese intelligence. He worked at a Chinese military academy. At the same time, there was a Chinese MP in Labour too. And there was a little bit of controversy about this, but not much. But notably, what National and Labour did do, basically simultaneously, is remove them both from the parties, right? So again, what was that about? Was that coordinated? Did Labour and National, did they get the word from the Australians and Americans of, hey, look, guys, we view this essentially as infiltration of your elite core, and you got to get rid of these people? I don't know, but that has happened. So,
yeah. Yes, it's fascinating because when I look at the media, who should be capturing a lot of this and sounding alarms if there are alarms, or at least just facilitating robust debate and bringing it into our consciousness, they're very quiet when it comes to a lot of these allegations, which then makes you feel somewhat like a conspiracy theorist if you bring it up, or worse, some sort of racist, because the people that you're potentially trying to shine a light on aren't the same color as you. So of course that makes you a racist now. So it kind of feels like it's really difficult to go after this. And it kind of speaks to what you're saying before, where we're very open in Western societies, and definitely too open for an adversary who would wish to take advantage of that, because they probably look at that like a gift. You make it so easy. Anyone can do this. There's no firewall, right? And I guess it just kind of makes me wonder if I was an investor trying to build up wealth for a new world, I want to make sure that that new world is good for me, right? Because it doesn't matter how wealthy I am if I've lost all my freedoms. But it just genuinely feels like in New Zealand, it's a taboo topic to actually talk about this sort of stuff. Like you're obviously in this space, it's what you do. But do you often find that there's a reluctance with mainstream media to actually have intelligent conversations around this? Or do they assume that the listening couch people public aren't really smart enough to actually understand what's going on? Because where I sit, they seem to be smart enough. Now, quick interruption here, just to share a really important insight that I have had during this conversation with Reuben Steff. It's really important, I think, as an investor, that you carve off a little bit of your income to prepare for a future world. But it's also really important to carve off a little bit of your headspace to think about what that future world will actually look like, both good and bad. And this is where I could potentially help you as a financial advisor. I specialize in thinking about that ratio between the already and the not yet, how things have worked in the past, but how things might work in the future. And I personally believe that you should construct a portfolio based on the likelihood of what will happen in the future. Now, how that looks in your own portfolio should be unique to your own circumstances. Do you invest in residential property in an environment where the politics around that is changing? Do you invest in managed funds that are passively managed in a world which is going through insane amounts of dynamism? Do you invest in digital assets which look like they're here today and gone tomorrow? Or should you just rest on precious metals? These are all really important, valid questions for you to ask your financial advisor. And if they're not having that conversation with you, I would love to. There is a link to a free 15-minute discovery call where we can talk about what it would be like to work with each other going forward to manage your wealth. Let's get back to the show.
Yeah. What I would say about the New Zealand media is that knowing some journalists now, having interactions with them in recent years, some will say, we'd like to do a lot more of this, but it's just not the priority of our organizations, because they're looking for clicks. And if the clicks are coming from other topics, other issues, sometimes like tabloid level crap, unfortunately, the market is going to drive them in that direction. Maybe there is a bit of hesitance too. There's a bit of like whataboutism too. So, a news story that they feel implicitly might criticize China. Some of their readers will turn around and say, well, what about United States? They're doing this and that. Why are you focusing on just China? Why are you beating up on China? Of course, you can you can criticize both, right? We should be able to have some level of balance. But there is an anti-Americanism in New Zealand, right? Going back to the 1980s anti-nuclear crisis and so on. So I think there's often a kind of concern about beating up on others because then you're not giving fair treatment to beating up on the United States, if you will.
Yeah.
And look, there have been I think some people are maybe a bit worried about their own personal safety too, right? Anne-Marie Brady apparently was threatened, had her laptops and other things stolen, her offices broken into. So maybe if you're a journalist or another academic, you go, well, I'd like to say something about this, but I'm just not going to do it. The potential stakes aren't worth it. And even if nothing will manifest, even if some of the stuff's exaggerated, why even walk in that direction at all? Yeah. But yeah, journalists also in New Zealand, they're so time poor. They're pulled in a million different directions. I mean, there's been a lot of consolidation. New Zealand's mainstream media is always in a state of semi-crisis, Traditional journalism, I mean, there's still pockets of it, but a lot of it seems to be kind of going away over time. We have the alternative media emerging. A lot of people getting their news from YouTube or TikTok. So again, the media itself is just in a battle to survive, I think. So this is only one concern among many, but you would have thought there would have been more broad-based discussion and debate about these things in New Zealand than there have been, especially compared to other parts of the Western world. It's also that we do have a kind of far left so-called peace groups agenda commentators, and they will brutally come after you. Like I've had people criticize me, call me a warmonger and so on. And sometimes I'm like, guys, I'm just trying to raise these issues for discussion. Sometimes I'm not even 100% sure. I'm just trying to say, hey, shouldn't we kind of test this issue? And, you will get brutally criticized. People will email you saying all sorts of crazy stuff. And you're like, geez, there's some unhinged individuals, including on social media out there. So I think a lot of people say it's not worth it.
Yeah, no, I 100% know exactly what you're talking about. And it seems like, well, why do you bother trying to fight for these people, right? Because that's effectively what you're doing by raising the alarm, or not even raising the alarm, just having a conversation. So I just want to maybe shine a little bit of a light on New Zealand's military, if you don't mind as well. And I'm a little bit out of touch with kind of how things evolve over time with New Zealand's military. I brought our kids to an air cadet information evening. I know it's not technically part of the military, but it was just interesting to kind of get a bit of a sample for that culture. And it kind of made me think, well, yeah, this is pretty cool, right? Like I know as our society kind of goes on, we kind of get disconnected from wartime like activities, and then it kind of feels nostalgic to go to those sorts of things. But if you look at the world for what it is right now, not what we want it to be through our ideological lenses, it does appear like we are going closer towards global conflict in some of these key areas, and maybe all together at once. We never know. But just as it relates to New Zealand in particular, the first question I have would be around our nuclear stance. Do you see any softening around that?
So we'd have to see what the public polling says. The polling has shifted on some issues in a way that has been a little bit surprising in recent years, in that if you go back only a few years ago, New Zealanders were very skeptical of the need to spend more on the military. That has changed quite dramatically in the last couple of years, where in recent polling, I think the majority are saying, no, we need to do something about how wound down and degraded our military has become, because we've only been spending about 1% of GDP on the military. Facilities are falling apart. Our Navy sometimes can't even get out to sea. The PM, military transporters, the Prime Minister sometimes travels on, break down constantly. There's been story after story of people within the military saying, hey, look, things are getting really bad here. We're sort of wondering why we're trying to hold on. Our salaries are really low and so on. It's not good for families anymore. So I think this has seeped into New Zealand society saying we've got a problem there. As it pertains to the nuclear piece, that's something I haven't seen much polling on. But what I find personally is just about anyone over 50, they see New Zealand's anti-nuclear policy as kind of part of the New Zealand national identity.
Yeah.
The younger you go, the more and more people are like, well, hold on a second. What is this anti-nuclear identity you're talking about? Or what about climate change? That's a major issue. Nuclear power could be useful for that. There's now small modular nuclear reactors slowly coming online that could help with something like that. We have to deal with the reality that sometime in the next probably 10, 15 years, the Australians are going to have nuclear-powered submarines, which are incredibly, if not the most technologically sophisticated military platforms on the planet, that are going to be in service. First, they're going to probably sort of lease Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the United States, and then through the AUKUS Pact, build their own AUKUS-class nuclear-powered submarines. Australia is our single military ally in the world. If something goes wrong down here, the only country that is obligated by treaty to come to our assistance is Australia. It's not the United States anymore. It's Australia. So if there's some problem, are we going to say to Australia, well, sorry, don't send those incredible nuclear-powered submarines that can get here faster than any other capability you have because we have legislation from the 1980s that prevents it? I don't know. I find that a hard argument to make.
Yeah.
So a softening, I suspect there is a softening, especially under the younger generations. At the political elite level, I'm not sure. We'd have to wade through and see what people like Winston Peters and people on the political right have said, even see what Christopher Luxon have said. Because at some point, our anti-nuclear legislation, it's either going to have to be modified or it's going to have to be debated because of all these changes that are occurring in the world. And we're just going to start wondering, well, is it nice to have this legislation that makes us feel better, but is no longer like fit for purpose and suits our strategic interests?
Yeah, no, I get it. So just thinking about the military spending in general, you're mentioning 1% of GDP. It sounds like that sounds absolutely pathetic, especially right now with where we're at. Is the problem with our military in New Zealand the lack of spending, or do you think that there might be some ideological capture which might be reducing its effectiveness as well?
It's probably a bit of both. The spending is going to increase, by the way. A defense capability plan was announced a few months ago. I mean, it should have come out years ago, but better late than never. That is going to see the spending increase to 2% of GDP over the coming years. It's actually going to lift quite a lot from where it is to where they want it to be. But, right now, New Zealand's military is a bit like a desert. So if you take unlimited amount of money and pour it into the desert, take a bottle of water and pour it into the scalding desert, it's just going to evaporate quickly. So it's going to be a progressive build-up, prioritization across the force of different areas that need to be expanded. They're going to replace the Navy wholesale over the coming years. They're buying new Sea Sprite helicopters, and these are very sophisticated platforms that have undersea capabilities too that can go after submarines. It's about creating a more networked, technologically sophisticated force. It's about purchasing drones. There's talk about having an actual kind of land-based strike platform, so actually bringing back some kind of hard kinetic firepower potentially that could go after platforms potentially in our immediate territorial seas or perhaps exclusive economic zone. But this is going to be a gradual build-up, albeit I think quite a swift one in the scheme of things, just given how badly degraded things have been. I think it's got to be pedal to the metal now if you want to have a military in place in time that could deal with threats in the foreseeable and potentially even near-term future, or 5-6 years out, if not sooner. Yeah. Ideologically, that's an interesting one because potentially part of our problem goes back to the early 2000s when the Helen Clark government essentially shifted New Zealand's military from a kind of more traditional posture military to essentially a peacekeeping force. Because they thought the future was going to be essentially peacekeeping operations. It was not going to be peer-to-peer. It was not going to be kinetic warfare between states. It was going to be, kind of peacekeeping operations. And so to some degree, that recalibrates the way the force looks. And if that's the force you have, but you now need to shift to an entirely different one, well, it probably makes the task a bit harder too. As it relates to the ideology in the armed forces, I'm not entirely sure because I tend to think if you are someone who's attracted to the military in the first place, you probably do have a slightly more traditional interpretation of what the military should be used for. And that is, hey, we may have to fight at times. I've got to be a soldier. I've got to be a Vulcan. They can try give me all these ideas of the end of history and the liberal rules-based order. But hey, at the end of the day, it could be me alongside my fellow troopers on the front lines fighting. So I tend to think the military mindset itself mitigates to some degree the kind of liberal ideology that was kind of maybe foisted upon them in recent decades. I could be wrong there. I'm not up to date to what degree sort of ideological capture of forms has occurred.
Right. Well, maybe this next question might help, I guess, because I only just came across this last night when a friend of mine shared this with me. I'm just going to share my screen here, so apologies for those that are listening. So this just came on my radar last night, which kind of is in line with what we said. I can see you're madly reading this to try and understand what this is, but I'll read the headline. New Zealand Defence Force exercise sparks concern over portrayal of Christianity as extremism. So just to be clear, this was a military exercise, and it's a leaked NZDF training material where a Christian extremist organization determined to see a return to traditional ways of Christian nation, heaven forbid, they were framed as the hypothetical enemy. So my question here, and this is what's concerning me, is that maybe there is some sort of ideologies that no matter how much we spend, we're just amplifying something which maybe it's been infiltrated. I don't know. It's been definitely been infiltrated by something if this is true. So is this just like a woke culture import operating at the highest levels of leadership within the NZDF? Or is it possible that this could reflect some fingerprints of a wider influence operation? I know that's very dangerous for me to even suggest that, but do you have any views you want to share on this?
Oh, look, I'll just say, if I'm the New Zealand military or New Zealand political leaders, don't let the Trump administration see this occurring, given the direction of travel over there, where you have a real resurgence, it seems, in support for Christianity, traditional Western values, etc. But hey, that's an aside conversation. This is a surrogate for extremism of all forms. I think New Zealand is, quite far behind some of the cultural, political developments we see underway in the United States and in parts of Central and Western Europe, where we really see that the momentum seems to be towards this kind of populist nationalism and to kind of a post-liberal ideology. And part of that is about, okay, we should be proud about being Westerners and what are our civilizational roots? Because what has happened is this woke ideology has come in and said, that's all evil, that's all bad. We need to start again from year zero. We need to reject all old orthodoxies of whatever they are. And that now, the counter energy is all coming from the populist right now and the post-liberal right, which is kind of it's aligned with far right, but it's also, I think, got a different conceptualization of where it wants Western regimes to be headed. But New Zealand, we kind of, God bless us in a way, we're always a bit far behind these things. And that may not be the worst thing too, because the level of polarization and social discohesion we see in other parts of the Western world hasn't come to New Zealand yet to the same degree. I think partly because New Zealand Kiwis, we're pretty lax people. We're pretty culturally chill when it comes to these things. We don't get as angry and energized about these culture wars as much as other Westerners have done in recent years. But what I think has happened here is that, if you're New Zealand government, reasonably, you're concerned about extremism of different forms emerging. And I mean, look, and that should be, whether that's Christian extremism or Islamic extremism, it doesn't matter. We're talking about pockets, groups, or individuals who have extremist mindsets who then use that to recruit people and then carry out attacks or wage conflict against mainstream society. So I think within our bubble, if you're the New Zealand Defence Force right now, if you want to run operations or think through how extremism could manifest, the safest thing to do in the New Zealand cultural political landscape is to talk about Christian extremism, right? But I suspect they are also thinking, hey, it could also be Islamic extremism. It could be this kind of recent wave of actual kind of left-wing nihilism, extremism we're seeing in the United States, where for the first year in many years, extremist attacks in the United States. There's been more left-wing extremist attacks than there have been right-wing extremist attacks. But again, that goes against the kind of cultural orthodoxy of recent years, where it's all about evil right-wing extremism and not left-wing extremism. We're actually seeing the pattern shift in the United States. So I think this is a safe way for the New Zealand Defence Force or New Zealand elites to game out what do we do if there's an extremist bubble that conducts attacks in New Zealand, and they have to say Christian extremism. They can't say they feel Islamic extremism because then they'll be attacked for being anti-Islamic or Islamophobic or whatever.
Maybe it's the easier target, right? But it's just interesting because
but then you look at the Bondi attacks, you look at the Bond attacks in Australia. You look at, there's been a few attacks that have been nipped in the bud in Germany in recent weeks. The French have had to basically curtail, if not shut down, a lot of their Christmas celebrations because they're worried about Islamic extremism. So I think it's extremism of every form we should be concerned about.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I guess this is probably a good place to finish it, because my last question really is about the mode that it feels like maybe individually, interpersonally, we conduct ourselves with at our place of employment and business, at the national level, nation stage, globally. This seems to be everywhere, this whole ambiguity thing, right? And it's a strategy. It's strategic ambiguity. No one really knows if you're going to stick up for this country. Are we going to back Taiwan? Or are we really going to side with the US if China hits our backyard? All those sorts of things. Do you feel like in 2026, we're going to see the end of strategic ambiguity and things will be a little bit more obvious?
It's all conditional upon what happens. We will not end that of our own accord unless there's some kind of, maybe an incredible deal on the table. I don't know what that would be, but could we imagine, well, some people say, Trump is anti-free trade. The truth is Trump, during his first term and this term, has done a whole bunch of different economic deals. Now, some of those deals, how kind of significant they are, or whether they will actually translate into real deals, I'm not sure. But I've played around with a scenario before, like, okay, what if the Americans come to us, and they might be saying this already behind the scenes, hey, look, New Zealand, you're part of the Five Eyes. You are basically an ally of the United States. And I hear right now there are sort of MAGA appointees in the Trump administration that when they deal with our officials in Washington, D.C., they tell us that we're allies. And our officials are like, hold on, no. We haven't got a treaty with you. And they're like, yeah, whatever. You're allies with us, okay? Just cut the crap. But I can imagine the Americans, if they want to put pressure on New Zealand, say, hey, do you want to be in the Five Eyes? Do you want to be part of the Western Alliance? Do you want access to the best artificial intelligence software that we have? Well, then you got to really show where you are. You got to basically come out. You got to say you're allies with us once again. You got to basically say you'll align with us on the front lines if you have to, if it comes to a fight over Taiwan or the South Pacific or wherever. And in exchange, you'll remain an ally in good standing. But hey, maybe there's even an economic deal on the table for you. Maybe there is kind of a military industrial deal on the table, a bit like AUKUS or something like it, or AUKUS itself, because AUKUS is as much a military industrial compact between the US, UK, and Australia as it is just about these nuclear-powered submarines. It actually goes a lot further into military technologies and all sorts of other things. Maybe they'll also say, hey, we also want you to be a military base for us. We want you to be a supply depot because, again, we don't know if there's a conflict in the Pacific, how it's going to play out. And yes, Australia are there. Australia, they are staging our bombers. Their military, their Marines in Australia. The Australians are becoming kind of on a military industrial level integrated into the American military industrial supply chain. The Americans are going to be handing over the most sophisticated AI, quantum computing, nuclear industry to Australia through AUKUS. But what we also want behind the lines is a supply depot. And that could be you guys, New Zealand. So maybe there's some grand bargain in the wings we're waiting to hear about. And then New Zealand will come out and say, okay, kind of this sliver of ambiguity we like to have is now over. And we are basically going to go all in like the Australians have. We will not do that unless I think there's either an incredible deal on the table or there's a conflict or something that breaks out in the Pacific and the Americans say, okay, now New Zealand, what friggin' side are you on? You have to choose. But until something like that occurs, we will just continue as long as we can to play out this kind of independent foreign policy.
this represents possibly one of the greatest opportunities from a wealth building perspective as a nation that we're probably going to see for a long time to actually pick a side. But I just don't see it.
Yeah, look, I'll just add quickly, like, look at our economy. What is it? Agriculture, tourists, some services. What is the budding part of our economy that we really need to accelerate in this century? It's the tech sector. And that's probably going to come down to investment from abroad, especially investment tied to military technologies.
Yeah.
That's
which is a spillover to infrastructure as well, right?
Everything.
Which is what we're desperately short on.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Fascinating conversation. Now, Reuben, I don't want to let you go without pumping or promoting anything. I know you've written a new book recently, so you're welcome to speak to that. Or where can people follow you on social media?
Google my name, Reuben Steff. I'm on LinkedIn if they want to look me up there. Also on Twitter, X, which I go on and off of. Sometimes I go on and have a blizzard of arguments with people, and then I stay away for a while. But I do promote my writings and so on there. This year, I've stepped back a bit and mainly done a lot of observing. But I think going into next year, I'm going to pick up the pace with publications and op-eds and so on. But the main thing is I put out a book at the beginning of this year called New Zealand's Geopolitics and the US-China Competition. Because the New Zealand discourse, going back to some of our earlier conversation, it's really missing, I think, a stark, geopolitically informed explanation of what's happening in the world and how it relates directly to New Zealand, to our territorial position, to our material interests. So that's what that book is really about. It's about saying the US-China competition is the dominant structural, systemic level relationship in the world right now that affects everything else: supply chains, economics, technology, geostrategic calculations, the South Pacific itself, and therefore New Zealand. And this book is all about building out a comprehensive picture of how we relate to that competition. So I would say track down that book, New Zealand's Geopolitics and the US-China Competition, if you want to see my kind of fullest thoughts on what's happening in the world right now. And I'll be hopefully leveraging that a bit more next year too.
Awesome. Thanks again, Reuben. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers, Darcy. Appreciate it. You too.